often do you hear people say, well, if there was a conspiracy, we would know about it, as if they are just so smart they pretty much catch everything that goes on. I want to give you a handful of books today that you definitely need in your conspiracy library. I give them my stamp of approval because they use good sources. A lot of them make logical arguments defending how this can be done, why it's possible, and why it's important. The first book is called Coverups. I have not read this whole thing, but there is basically just a collection of the biggest, most popular conspiracies that people reference, and he gives the evidence for, the possible explanations against, everything from Area 51 to Bohemian Grove, the Council on Foreign Relations, 9/11, Pearl Harbor, MK Ultra, Roswell, the New World Order, Nazi gold, Holocaust denial, Majestic 12 even he gets into, the Trilateral Commission, just a lot of very interesting stuff in this book. The next one is called Inside the Illuminati by Mark Dice. The guy's a jerk for the most part, but if you can see how much stuff I thought was important to highlight, let that be a nice little stamp of approval. He gets into affiliated secret societies. He gets into early evidence that such societies exist. Just a lot of really interesting things. It's a great introduction to the things that are very important. The next one is Pawns in the Game by William Guy Carr. This is an old one, and he cites a letter by Albert Pike that may or may not be legitimate, but the interesting thing is that even if it's a fake, in the 1950s he was talking about a third world war between the Arab Middle East and Zionists. Very interesting stuff. This next one might be the most important just because it's by someone who is a whistleblower. It's called Proofs of a Conspiracy by John Robison against all the religions and governments of Europe carried on in the secret meetings of Freemasons, Illuminati, and reading societies. It was published by Forgotten Books. A lot of interesting stuff in there. This was published in 1798. But if someone was involved, we would have heard about it by now. Well, if you haven't heard about it and it was published in 1798, that argument's pretty much ridiculous. This book is called The Rockefellers, An American Dynasty by David Horowitz and Peter Collier. This is an unbelievable book. You can find a lot of quotations from it, but it's when David Horowitz was still an anti-capitalist leftist. A lot of important stuff in there regarding the Rockefeller family. Speaking of which, this book called Memoirs by David Rockefeller is so important because of the following quote. David Rockefeller was chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, started the Trilateral Commission with Zbigniew Brzezinski. I don't have Brzezinski's books, but the Grand Chessboard is very important, as well as Between Two Ages. He wrote both of those. Here's a quote from the Proud Internationalist chapter of David Rockefeller's Memoirs book. For more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents such as my encounter with Castro to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield power over the American political and economic institutions. Here it is. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty and am proud of it. But if it were true, someone would have spoken out. Well, when David Rockefeller writes it in his memoirs, I don't know how much more clear this can be. The next two, I'm only counting as one, The House of Rothschild by Niall Ferguson. Amazing research in these two. No, I have not gotten through all of them, but the reason these are important is because Ferguson was given access to documents that no one else had been given access to. Of course, I'm not saying I agree with everything. Can't believe you constantly have to say that on YouTube. But Niall Ferguson really does an amazing job at exposing the amount of power, influence, and the history that the Rothschild family has been behind. The next one is Propaganda by Edward Bernays. Very thin book. He is the nephew of Sigmund Freud, pioneered the scientific technique of shaping and manipulating public opinion, which he called engineering of consent. During World War I, he was an integral part, along with Walter Lippmann, of the U.S. Committee on Public Information, CPI, a powerful propaganda machine that advised and sold the war to the American people as one that would make the world safe for democracy. The marketing strategies for all future wars would be based on the CPI model. Duh! What do you think we're in the Middle East for? We're there to spread democracy. Idiots can't keep Washington, D.C. safe from drugs, crime, and horrible things. You think they can go to Afghanistan and Iraq where they don't know the culture, they don't know the history, they don't speak the language, the people hate them for killing their civilians? You can't do it in D.C., right outside where all of them live. You can't do it in the Middle East. It's too ridiculous to even take seriously. The next one is 63 Documents the Government Doesn't Want You to Read by Governor Jesse Ventura. I've made a whole video about this, just reading the contents. This book is so important because it cites the primary evidence. It's not hearsay or anything like that. Again, just obliterates the claim that we would have heard about these things by now if they were true. A lot of them are. He provides the documentation with it. This next book is a great history book, The Unseen Hand, An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History by A. Ralph Epperson. This gentleman is still alive and in Sedona. I really hope to get an interview with him. I have underlined so many of the important topics in here just because he cites so many sources. He's done so much research on this. He goes into everything from, I will just go down the contents briefly. He goes into World War II, communist betrayals, the Korean War, humanism. Goes into God or government, freedom, communism, secret societies, money and gold, Russian Revolution, Cuban Revolution, Iron Mountain, World War I, nonviolent organizations, population control, the Civil War, the Monroe Doctrine, the Trilateral Commission, and throughout it, he discusses the Council on Foreign Relations. Unbelievable book. I can't believe it's not more popular. Terry Mason wrote The Perfectibilists, the 18th century Bavarian order of the Illuminati. So when someone says, oh, you believe in the Illuminati because Beyonce and Obama and the Queen of England, it's such an unbelievable distraction from the actual evidence, along with the other book Proofs of a Conspiracy, that Terry Melanson gives in this book, The Perfectibilists. He gives you great pictures to bring it to life, and it's just a terrific read. This is probably the best introduction to conspiracies that you can give someone. Gary Allen wrote this book. None dare call it conspiracy. I love how he opens the book. He says, so people can imagine that, say, Hitler or Stalin would intentionally lie to people, commit acts of violence in order to have more power. So Hitler could do it, Stalin can do it, in Russia and Germany. Is it possible that someone born in New York could do it? Could their name be David Rockefeller by any chance? Just an excellent logical attempt to convince people that this can be real. The next book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America by Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt. This book goes through the education system and the communist, globalist, fascist infiltration of the education system. She uses, so like right here, she goes by each year and tells you things that happened and short progressions that were made. You know, I look at the plans that these people clearly had, it's in their own writings, hundreds of years in advance, going back to Plato, for God's sakes. And it just terrifies me that libertarians are not better organized. This book will make you physically sick. It's called The Franklin CoverUp, Child Abuse, Satanism, and Murder in Nebraska by John D. Camp. He was in office for 16 years as a senator. He initiated Operation Baby Lift, highly decorated Vietnam War veteran. He practices law in Lincoln, Nebraska. So a lawyer, senator for 16 years, and Vietnam veteran comes out and exposes pedophile rings of the rich and famous, and people still say, but if it were true, we'd hear about it. Ugh! The next one is called The Shadows of Power, The Council on Foreign Relations, and The American Decline by James Perloff. This is another great book because what it does is it gives you pictures all throughout, which makes it 100 times more realistic and real to you. He doesn't do a great job with citing primary sources as I wish he would, but really gets into things like Carter and the Trilateral Commission, takes a second look at Ronald Reagan, talks about the media. He talks about the Council on Foreign Relations. The CFR and FDR was a great one. Just terrific things. Again, Establishment's War in Vietnam. Very important chapter as well. Next book, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler by Anthony C. Sutton. That book talks about how the 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act was enforced on a group called Union Banking for funding the National Socialists in Germany. The head of Union Banking was a guy named Prescott Bush, grandfather to George Bush Sr., and father to George Bush Sr., grandfather to George Bush 43. Apple doesn't fall far, does it? Next one is by the same author, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. The remarkable true story of American capitalists who financed the Russian communists. This book is great because he gives you the primary source of Jacob Schiff documenting a transfer of money to the communists in Russia. And he also gives a logical explanation for why we think of capitalists and communists as totally different ends of the spectrum, when often it's capitalists, George Soros, financing communist movements. Another book by Anthony Sutton, America's Secret Establishment, An Introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones, 322. Again, in 2004, Americans had two Skull and Bones fraternity brothers running against each other for president. Yeah, thanks for the choices, you sons of bitches. This book is on 9/11, Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World, by Christopher Bolin. The Israeli Mossad historically has staged false flags such as 1954, the Lavon Affair, 1948, the bombing of the King David Hotel, and 1967, the attack on the USS Liberty. What they did in that one was they killed U.S. soldiers in order to ignite the spirit of people wanting to go to war in the Six-Day War against Egypt. Unbelievable parallels. Finally, The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve by G. Edward Griffin. It's great to see someone get into libertarian politics as well as expose the conspiracies that we are subject to. This book is great. I can't endorse it enough. There's so many things. The 5th edition is especially important because it has summaries at the end of every chapter. It also has a Q&A right after the preface, getting into the Fabian Society. The Federal Reserve, obviously, is the creature he's referring to. He talks about how bankers have often funded both sides of wars. All very important stuff. Thank you so much for watching. I know it's a longer video than usual. All those books are very important. Please comment below. Let me know what a shill I am, how I intentionally leave things out, because I too am part of the New World Order. Thank you again for watching. Keith and I don't tread on anyone. Have a good one. Thank you.